All right, we've been looking at a lot of what a lot of water did. I didn't realize there was so much evidence for creationism and a recent creation by an intelligent designer, and so much against evolution. Even the evolutionists we discovered yesterday finally consented to the fact that the Ice Age could not have been accomplished by having one right after the other. They couldn't explain that by uniformitarianism, or what we see today is how it happened in the past. They said it had to be something of a catastrophic nature. Best guess, they said, would be, many of them said this reluctantly, a lot of water. And it happened all around the planet, because they said this ice age was a one-time ice age that was created by a whole bunch of water throughout the whole planet at the same time. What do you call a worldwide flood? And he said, well, we're looking for another solution. So it's not a matter whether you believe it or not, whether there's scientific evidence for it or not. It's whether you believe that what should happen, and then you take the facts and alter them to support your own beliefs. This is not we're not looking for that. We're looking for scientific evidence, which is best. We're looking at K43. We have some conclusions to look at. Oops, let me take the caps out. K43, okay. And we want to look for a conclusion. A catastrophic universal flood is the only way to explain the Earth today. But right above that, I'm fascinated with this. I have to do this again. Maybe I'll do a separate thing on it. It's unbelievable. A vase found in prehistoric rock, really old prehistoric rock, according to the evolutionists, geologists, indicates civilization has always been there, extant, pointing to a recent creation which always included mankind. I'm reading this. This vase, or vase, was found in, I would call it a vase, so it's significant, was found in 1851 in Dorchester, Massachusetts, USA. It was discovered in solid rock. The rock formation is known as the Roxbury conglomerate, which is preCambrian, supposedly over 534 million years old. What created that rock? What life forms were around? Did an amoeba create it? This rock is supposed to be a record of life on Earth before any multicellular life evolved. Well, who created this? Yet here is an undeniable human artifact. Man supposedly appeared no more than 21 to 22 million years ago in his most primitive form, according to evolution. This object refutes the whole evolutionary interpretation of the strata we see worldwide, and supports the creationist assertion that most of the strata were formed during the global flood. This could be an artifact from a pre-flood civilization. In the June 5th, 1852, Scientific American article, pages 298 to 299, about this alloy vessel. It's a very complex alloy vessel made of metal, not pottery. It says something interesting. The editor suggests the vessel may have been made by Tubal-Cain, the biblical father of metallurgy. Tubal-Cain is found in Genesis 4:22, which is before the flood. This same scientific magazine today is totally anti-creationist and anti-biblical. Darwin had not succeeded in getting the educational institutions to preach his theory yet. This evidence supports a literal reading of Genesis, and it totally destroys the evolutionary idea of millions and billions of years for the formation of the geologic record. Of course, somebody's going to say, yeah, somebody planted it there. Well, it's not for record to indicate it's a genuine vase embedded in the rock formation at the Roxbury conglomerate, which is pre-Cambrian, over 534 million years old, or maybe not. Maybe the worldwide flood. So, let's go to the conclusion. The universal flood, wants to come back to the vase, is the only way to explain the Earth today. Many things have happened. When the worldwide flood came along, it destroyed it all and reconstituted the topography of the Earth and the mountain ranges and the seas and everything. Throughout the 18th century and well into the 19th, and most theologians of the Western world correctly believed that the deluge was responsible for the major fossiliferous strata of the earth. But the rise of Cuvier's false theory of successive catastrophes, which assigned most of the rock strata to ages long before the creation of man, which is totally unbiblical, caused many to abandon the older and biblical flood theory of geology in spite of unsubstantiated claims. People are just excitable. I guess they're such God haters that they say, well, we'll take anything. William Buckland led the way in Great Britain by falsely pointing to diluvium deposits as positive evidence of the last and greatest catastrophe in a fictitious series of catastrophes in the history of the earth, the Genesis flood. But no sooner had a large number of Christians accepted the successive catastrophes viewed than Buckland and Sedgwick, along with other geologists, began to make public recantations of their former views. The diluvium deposits were no longer attributed to the flood, but to the last of a series of pre-Adamic catastrophes. The flood, though still regarded as universal, was now falsely depicted as a comparatively tranquil affair which led no discernible geologic effects, really. Continental shelves, moving away of the continents, the mountain ranges, all of the geologic effects on the earth were thereby falsely attributed to events occurring over a fictitious period of time before Adam, when Scripture indicates no such thing. So they have the pre-Adamic race. Of course, the Bible teaches that death didn't come until after Adam and Eve were created. By now, the church was ready for the final and false stage of the forced harmonization process between the true biblical flood account and the false theory of alocal and numerous local floods. For in 1839, John Pye Smith set forth his theory that the flood was nothing but a local inundation in the Mesopotamian valley, freed at long last from the necessity of harmonizing false theories of geology with Genesis. Scientists dismissed the Genesis flood from their minds. It's all just picturesque, mythological stuff, and joined Sir Charles Lyell in his efforts to patiently untie the Gordian knot of fossiliferous strata according to the false uniformitarian principles which he had enunciated as early as 1830. Oh, he got a lot of attention. Thus it was under that steadily increasing blows of erroneous geological theorizing, which was never proved, the biblical flood faded from the intellectual horizon of the Western world to a mere shadow of its former awe-inspiring grandeur, from a world-engulfing cataclysm to a mere Mesopotamian inundation. Many theologians of the 19th century, nurtured by a somewhat anemic philosophy of revelation, stopped studying the Bible by utilizing a liberal approach of interpretation which permitted false spiritualizing of scriptural passages to mean whatever one desired them to mean. They do that today. They fell into line with the latest scientific speculations, which were actually unscientific and false, fearing lest they might be found at odds with Copernicus and Galileo, again, as the geologists were always ready to remind them that science was their new religion, rather than fearing being at odds with God. See, the whole point is, if you spiritualize, you come up with your own personal interpretation, you can't harmonize the Bible, because you're going to read all kinds of passages that reject what you just misinterpreted. The only way you know the Bible is reliable is if you read it properly, taking the words for what they say, and then being alarmed at how remarkable it doesn't contradict itself, doesn't create errors, predicts the future perfectly. But if you want to start spiritualizing, you have to rewrite the whole thing, and you're still going to come up with one contradiction after another. That's why a lot of times people listen to people who are fake Christians interpreting the Bible, and they say, see, the Bible is nonsense. Yes, their interpretation of it, but if they would bother to read it correctly, not skip around and cherry pick, you'd find it's a remarkable book. The viewpoint that science rather than the Scripture must speak the final word on the magnitude of the flood certainly did not die with the 19th century, as the wholehearted acceptance by evangelical theologians of the evidence of Sir Leonard Woolley's flood stratum so clearly demonstrates. Nevertheless, a significant minority of Christians have continued to look upon these false harmonizations of Genesis and geology with profound misgivings, and would concur with the judgment of Andrew E. White that each mixed up more or less of science with more or less of Scripture and produces a result more or less absurd. From this study, we may draw one vitally important lesson for the present hour, White says. The biblical doctrine of the flood cannot be harmonized with the false uniformitarian theories of geology. A careful examination of the various blind alleys into which evangelical Christians have been led should serve as a solemn warning to those who are still persisting in the hopeless task of harmonizing two mutually exclusive philosophies of nature and history. It is the conviction of the writers, at least, that a true historical geology will never be formulated until the Genesis flood, as a universal aqueous catastrophe, is granted its rightful and vital place in the thinking of Christian men of science. So, let's move on to K53. This is vital. Methods of age measurement indicate a young Earth. Indicating a young Earth. But whenever they were used by evolutionists, they turned it all around and only took the evidence that they misappropriated and misinterpreted to prove their case. I remember one geologist discovered uranium and lead in one rock, and he tried to indicate, because of his preconceived idea of how old that rock should be, according to their textbooks, and measured it multiple times and found how old it was that satisfied him. He got 3 or 4 different results that are vastly different from one another. And if that rock stayed there for all that time, millions of years, it would have been rained upon so that some of the uranium would leach away. The lead is not soluble, but the uranium is. And so it would completely falsify the results anyway. So much for that. Even aside from the biblical testimony against the radioactivity age estimates for the Earth and its formations, there are numerous evidences in geology itself against the validity of these tremendous time durations. The currently accepted figure for the age of the Earth, as deduced from radioactivity of uranium and other elements, is about 5 to 6 billion years, with the solidification of the crust dated about 4 billion years ago. Let's investigate this. But there are many geological processes which appear to be at least as suitable for geochronometric purposes as the phenomena of radioactivity, and which give much more lower estimates than this. None of these is sufficiently precise for accurate measurements, and all involve the same sort of unlikely assumptions as the radioactivity methods. Uranium is soluble. Perhaps during the worldwide flood, when the canopy is reduced to nothing and it flows into water on the planet, overflows it, that the sunlight directly upon the Earth now increases the radiometric ages, whereas before it was protected from that and didn't excite the radiometric components, substances, and so things went a lot slower. So you can't tell. But they are nevertheless sufficiently meaningful, so we'll investigate them, to cast very serious doubts on the reliability of the radioactivity estimates. We'll investigate how the laboratory decide. They decide what the results are that they want it to be, and then they stage the laboratory or in-field experiments to support their evidence, and when it doesn't come, they just keep doing until they find something that does. By all odds, the most important and serious of problems relative to origins is that of time. There are many lines of geological evidence apparently implying that the Earth and its various crustal formations are immensely older than a straightforward biblical system of interpretation can allow. The latter, as we have seen, involves a relatively recent creation and deluge as the cause of most of the Earth's geologic features. There are many ways by which geologists have attempted to measure the absolute age of the Earth and its various formations and deposits. In each such method, some physical